Hello, everybody, and welcome to this webinar on supporting business environment reforms in fragile and conflict-affected situations. Thank you for joining this webinar. And while additional participants are still joining, I just wanted to start with a few opening remarks. My name is Judith van Doorn. I work in the ILO on the topic of enterprise formalization, and I will be facilitating this session for you. And I will switch on my camera so that you can see who I am. This session will be recorded, just for you to know. And this topic is very relevant because we are living in a world with multiple crises, and some of them have been around for years or even decades, and some are more recent. So the timing of this topic is very relevant. We are talking about conflicts. So there's conflicts between countries, also within countries. We know there's the Ukraine-Russia war, but there is conflict on other continents, Asia, Africa, Middle East, especially, but not only. But we're also going to talk about fragility. And this means that even many more people in many situations are affected. So we can think about social vulnerabilities, economic, political, security issues, and environmental issues. And we'll hear a bit more about the numbers of people affected by this later on. And we also know that the COVID pandemic has had an impact on this as well. So there are many different dimensions that affect fragility. The private sector plays an important role for people to have jobs and livelihoods and deal with these difficult circumstances. But in order to have a well-operating private sector, we need a conducive business environment. And we also know that business environment reforms can be quite challenging already in general, and in particular in fragile and conflict-affected situations. And on top of that, many of these situations have high degrees of informality, which adds another layer of complexity. Now, in this webinar, we will be talking about how to engage in business environment reforms in fragile and conflict-affected situations. And what we have on the agenda today is first a discussion on the challenges and also lessons learned on how to deal with business environment reforms in fragile and conflict-affected situations. And we'll also look at how informality comes into play. We'll zoom in on a case study with lessons from Gaza and the West Bank, and we'll also hear an analysis of 4 African countries. After that, we'll have some reflections from the World Bank, and then we'll open up for questions and answers from you as participants. Please, for Q&A, use the Q&A box, so not the box, but the Q&A box, because this will help us to better manage and answer your questions. We're on a tight schedule. We have many interesting speakers, so I would like to request the speakers to stay within the allocated time. And before we go into the speakers of today with the presentations, I want to hand over to Ms. Mona Haddad, who is the Global Director for Trade, Investment, and Competitiveness at the World Bank. She will share the opening remarks. Over to you, Ms. Haddad.
Thank you very much, Judith, and thank you for organizing this very important webinar. It's a pleasure to see this level of interest around a topic that is so central for promoting inclusive and sustainable growth. Addressing the challenges of fragility, conflict, and violence is critical to achieving the World Bank's twin goals of ending extreme poverty and boosting shared prosperity. Whether we're talking about Burundi, Nigeria, Lebanon, or Ukraine, countries that are classified as fragile and conflict-affected situations can range from low-income to more developed middle-income countries. They are inhabited by almost 1 billion people globally, 335 million of whom live in extreme poverty. The world is also facing the largest forced displacement ever recorded. And these numbers continue to rise. It's estimated that FCS will be home to 2/3 of the global poor by 2030. This alarming trend, along with the eruption of new conflict situations, such as the ongoing Ukraine-Russia war, has prompted renewed interest from policymakers and donor agencies in formulating impactful ways to counter fragility. Private sector growth can not only help reverse the economic impact of fragility, conflict, and violence, but also serve as a counteracting force through job creation and rebuilding public trust and social capital. Recognizing that the private sector lies at the center of a sustainable development model in FCV settings, swift and effective action is needed for its development and resilience. While a sound business environment facilitates private sector development, private enterprises, whether they are domestic or foreign, face severe challenges operating in FCV countries, such as chronically poor governance and rent-seeking behavior, political instability, poor infrastructure, eroded public-private trust, and many others. Approaches employed by development partners and client countries must therefore be adapted to the distinct circumstances of FCV settings. Today, we will share some insights on the lessons we have learned and challenges we have faced in the design and implementation of business environment reforms. We will hear more about the link between informality and private sector resilience. We will also listen to specialists who will share their experience supporting business environment reforms in Ethiopia, Lebanon, Palestine, Somalia, and others. Before I turn to the panelists, I would like to emphasize that the World Bank Group, as a development institution, is committed to sustained and long-term engagement that can support business environment reforms in FCS countries, strengthen state functions to facilitate government to business service delivery, and build institutional resilience and capacity. I'm sorry I will not be able to stay for the full session, but I will leave you in the hands of our very seasoned FCS experts who have a lot of insights to share with you today. And now I will turn back to Judith, who will be moderating the panel session. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mona, for these important insights on the topic and the number of people affected, which is quite impressive, quite a lot. Thank you for also flagging the importance of the private sector to counteract the challenges that these people face. And with that, I would like to hand over to Tanya Hossain, who is Senior Private Sector Specialist in the Global Investment Climate Unit of the World Bank, and Noraz Rana, who's an economist with the Global Business Regulation team of the World Bank, to share their insights on what works in business environment reforms in fragile and conflict-affected situations. Over to you.
Thank you, Judith. Thank you, Mona, for the overarching briefing about FCS, what are the challenges that are faced by a lot of countries that are grappling with these issues. Ella, could you please put up the PowerPoint? Thank you. So my colleague Thani and I, we recently published a paper that looked at what type of business environment reforms tend to have successful impact and what are the key lessons that are learned through programmatic interventions in World Bank countries, where we've designed and implemented private sector development as well as business environment reforms. It also factors in qualitative and quantitative research and data and existing literature to produce a very tangible output which directs and guides development practitioners, development organizations, and even governments on how to implement business environment reforms. So I would request Ella to please move to the next slide. Yes, so I wouldn't spend much time here. As Mona has earlier briefed, that FCS is a huge challenge for countries and even subnational regions. It impacts job employment, creation, growth, and it has also resulted in a lot of displacement, refugee crisis, and various major high-level issues that impedes the goals that the World Bank Group tends to focus on, which is shared prosperity and poverty reduction. Can you please move to the next slide? So when we're talking about addressing these challenges, there are various interventions, there are various ways how to tackle it. And among those, private sector development is one key solution that is at the forefront, because it is both a problem as a solution, because the private sector in majority FCS countries tends to be small, it is weak, and it is underdeveloped. And therefore, it impedes the potential of these countries and the people living within them to really harness their potential, achieve maximum growth. And it is because of the underlying fact that there is a security environment which is non-conducive, there's political instability, the institutions are not very well coordinated, and there's lack of capacity, there's elite capture, which tends to deter competition, there's presence of state-owned enterprises, and therefore the private sector does not tend to usually function the way it does in non-FCS settings. So please, could you move to the next slide, Ella? So when we talk about developing the private sector, it's a very holistic and a very broader approach. It factors in various areas. We talk about financial sector development, we talk about promoting sustainable infrastructure, we talk about access to energy and power. And within all these, creating an enabling environment, that is the rules and regulations that tend to dictate the way businesses and entrepreneurs work, the facilities and the support that they have, is a major complement and a component to the other broader aspects of private sector development. And it really helps break free from the fragility trap. So when we say business environment reforms, I would just want to delve in and highlight what that really means. So we're looking at how to facilitate business entry, business operations, as well as growth, and also business exit throughout the entire life cycle phase of businesses and corporations and firms that tend to exist in FCS settings. So we're looking at legal frameworks, we're looking at institutional frameworks, how various agencies and ministries tend to work together in a systemic way, in a coordinated way. We're talking about access to government to business protocols, digital technology, all of them which come together and help create a more conducive environment which promotes private sector and private sector firms within any country or subnational region. Ella, can you please move on? Next. And it is very important to also emphasize that business environment reforms is a huge dictator in how investment decisions, both at the foreign level and the domestic level, are taken. As you would see, we have a chart up there which factors in information from the Global Investment Competitiveness Report, and it highlights that among various decisions, the legal and regulatory environment is actually the third most frequently cited investor decision when it comes to the influx of funds and monetary injections in a country, whether that is an FCS country or whether that is a non-FCS country. And therefore, you would see, and my colleague would also elaborate, that many FCS countries tend to face this predominant issue where there's lack of investment, there's not enough inflow of wealth coming in that would help address majority of the private sector challenges. Can you please move on to the next slide, Ella? Yes. So the bigger question that comes, the very first question actually which comes to the mind is, what are the different types and themes of business environment reforms that are being implemented in FCS? But before we delve into that, we'll share more detail. But the bigger question and the key findings that we've been able to extrapolate based on our research, based on our intervention and our engagement, is that more than the type of business environment reforms, it is the way and the methodology in which they are implemented and they're also designed. So the very first thing is that FCS countries tend to differ from non-FCS countries just because of the security landscape. But even within FCS countries, there's an entire spectrum and they're very heterogeneous in terms of the issues that they face, the context of conflict of fragility, and the causes that tend to further or heighten their local landscape. So whenever we're talking about, implementing and designing business environment reforms, we really need to factor in the conflict sensitivity element. There's an important need to employ a do no harm approach, which means making sure that the status quo which led to the fragility and conflict situation arising in the first place is not reinforced. And similarly, there's a very important urgency and imperative to undertake a political economy analysis. That is making sure that whatever interventions and programs are designed, they factor in the various stakeholders, whether that is the government, whether that is the opposition groups, whether those are civil groups, and whether those are private sector firms, in making sure how those reforms would tend to, again, not reinforce the status quo that tends to exist, but would adopt and employ a more inclusive approach in making sure that the needs of these various stakeholders are addressed in a very particular and a proper manner. Next slide, please. But even within implementing and designing business environment reforms, there are a lot of challenges that we've seen development practitioners, whether the development organizations, the government itself tend to face. So one of them is the very obvious, the operational challenges, owing to the security environment, owing to the local landscape. There's lack of human and capital resources, there are travel constraints, and therefore projects take a longer time to get implemented and enacted compared to the same project or the same interventions that may be happening in a non-FCS setting. But even when we're talking about specific challenges to business environment reforms, what we see is that FCS countries, they are weak, that they're very weak politically, even if they're not in a conflict situation. Even, the fragility arises from the fact that the institutions are not working on capacity, there's not the right quality of governance, and therefore issues related to corruption, rent-seeking are generally more heightened than they would be in a non-FCS setting. So when we're talking about business enabling environment reforms, which talks about revamping the business environment, a lot of the challenges are actually faced from within different levers and tools of engagement. And therefore, it is very necessary to ensure that there's a general level of government buy-in. Next page, please. Next slide. So it leads us to the next very organic question as to what are the ways to address these business environment related challenges. So these are two components that what we have that we've come to. The first is, like I earlier mentioned, when we're designing these reforms, we need to make sure that the problem is rightly diagnosed. And for that, you have to go beyond traditional approaches to business environment reforms that are implemented elsewhere. We face that there are a lot of challenges to data collection. We cannot rely on the traditional approaches, the indicators such as CGI, such as the World Bank Enterprise itself, but we have to be more innovative, to gather the information that is existing on the ground. And for that, again, you have to employ things like big data, mobile phone surveys, geospatial imaging, wherever that is possible, to unearth and unravel what the real issues are before they are factored into the design. And then the next important thing is that how do you sequence and prioritize business environment reforms? There are a bunch of them, and the very first way to engage and enter, I would say, reform implementation is to first target the ones that are more simpler, the low-hanging fruits. Interventions, basic fundamental interventions such as G2B services and land registries tend to work. And once they are able to project the desired result, it is easier to gain the government's trust and to engage with them on more broader enabling environment reforms. Please, next slide. Yeah, my colleague Tanya will take it from here.
Thanks, Noraz, for setting the stage to this interesting topic. So in addition to what Noraz just mentioned, what are some of the key elements to consider while designing a business environment reform in fragile and conflict context? You will see in front of you 4 buckets, and then these have been identified through literature, including through the paper that was mentioned by Noraz, on what are some of the key elements. The first one is it's important to adopt an inclusive approach. So, and I think the World Bank, but also other development partners and international organizations can play a key role during conflict and crisis to pursue inclusive approaches to development interventions, including in business environment reforms. So some ways to achieve that would be by aiming to cover all business segments of a population when undertaking a reform. That would also include the youth, the vulnerable groups, minorities, and women. And in the context of fragile and conflict settings, inclusion is even more critical because typically marginalization is magnified. And we cannot also talk about inclusion without talking about the informal sector and firms operating in the shadow economy, including subsistence firms. And we'll hear more about that on the topic of informality that Nancy will be mentioning. The second important element is to focus on business environment reforms that level the playing field for the private sector or private operators, and putting in place competition enhancing policies and ones that could prevent poor governance, elite capture, cronyism. So lack of competition and uneven playing fields often result in FCS countries, but also in non-FCS countries. They come from monopolies, including state-owned monopolies, or even having complete sectors that are captured by the political elite or groups that are involved, for instance, in conflict or that have dominant power in the economy. So while designing and implementing programs, it's therefore important to remain conscious of pushback from actors with vested interest. And we'll talk more about this in the case study, and groups that could benefit from the statu quo that is in the country. And I will go more into details in the coming slide. The third element is to put in place the right institutional framework to carry out and sustain business environment reform. As Nora has mentioned, putting in place the right institutions is one of the key pillars for business environment reform. Example of this could include ensuring interagency coordination, which is crucial to eliminate implementation gaps, making sure that in the program design and deployment, we factor in institutional capacity and building the capacity of the institutions that are delivering the government services to businesses, removing bureaucratic redundancies, and also ensuring greater accountability and transparency. So according to a recent DCED study on this topic, we have seen that institutions play a central role that cuts across all the phases of the business life cycle. So they do impact firms' entries, for instance, during business registration and licensing, but it also impact operations. So in the granting of permits, competition, taxation, and then all the way through their exit. And examples of successful institutional reforms in the context of business environment could be, for instance, setting up one-stop shops for business registration and licensing, and they have shown good results across a number of countries. And then the fourth element that you see on the slide is to use public-private dialogue to promote trust among the different stakeholders and to ensure the support and the buy-in for meaningful reforms. But it's not only to pass the reform, but to make sure that it's sustainable. So public-private dialogue platforms not only support horizontal reforms in fragile and conflict setting, but that can also be a good starting point for the private sector to develop projects in key sectors. For instance, we've seen evidence from countries in the sectors of agribusiness and extractives, where public-private dialogue platforms have helped build the link between large-scale investments and the local economy. Next slide, please. So we will zoom in here. I mentioned earlier the need to adopt inclusive approach. So looking more closely at women in fragile setting, we see that they are affected disproportionately by violence and the aftermath. So if you look at the right side of the slide, you would see that we've analyzed data on gender equity, and we have noticed that gender issues in fragile and conflict setting are even more acute than ones in comparison to even low-income countries. So women as vulnerable groups do suffer more from the impact of violence and fragility in these contexts. But we also know from research that inclusive employment and job creation is one of the most effective means of breaking the cycle of violence and fragility. Therefore, more attention should be given to reforms that specifically focus on the experiences of vulnerable groups, and including minorities, women, the youth. And when designing and implementing reforms, policymakers should recognize the potential impact of the reforms on these groups and should take steps to mitigate any possible effects any reforms may have on these groups. Next slide, please. Okay, and then another topic that I just mentioned is the need for enhancing competition and the need to level the playing field for the private sector. Competition enhancing reforms help level the playing field for private sector, and they contribute to creating a more dynamic market. So there is more inclusion, there's more social cohesion in fragile and conflict settings. Elite capture is one of the ways in which competition distortion happens, and it manifests across a number of policy areas and can go from having influence by elite groups in policy makings to disproportionate allocation of incentives, allocation of public contracts, of licensing and permits to operate. While this issue is not specific to FCS context, it tends to be more accentuated there, given the weak governance and the weak rule of law. And we have seen examples from a number of countries across the world, be it the Central African Republic or Lebanon that Mona just mentioned. So these are some of many countries where the regulatory framework could be the leading factor to elite capture, and as they hamper market-based competition. So they do open the door for policies that are captured by the vested interest. So having a robust business environment is a necessary condition for increasing competitiveness. And you will see on the right side an example of a diagnostic we have done in Lebanon to identify gaps and entry points that are prone to elite or special interest capture in the country. This kind of data and diagnostics can actually help inform the design of privilege-resistant policies and identify the priorities where such action needs to be taken. So next slide, please. So next, we will highlight results from recent World Bank engagements where we have adopted some of the approaches Noraz and I just mentioned. I will go over Nigeria and then Somalia, and I know that Andrea will also highlight results from Palestine. But I also invite you to look at the paper we published because it has additional examples as well. And I know that John later on will also mention some examples from African countries. So first of all, the reform in Nigeria. What were some of the challenges that at the start of the project we were faced with? First of all, the country had a number of bottlenecks and bureaucratic constraints across a variety of business environment areas. The federal structure of the country needed reforms both at the national and state level. There was a lack of political support and will from government agencies to reform. And Nigeria was a country where, by speaking to the private sector, we had seen, and also like the evidence, we had seen that there was some capture in some of the areas in the business environment. So the approach that was adopted based on a competitiveness report that was produced in 2016, the federal government established PEBEC, which is the Presidential Enabling Business Environment Council, and EBIS, the Enabling Business Environment Secretariat. So these two entities helped ensure the traction of government reforms, but also the coordination among the different stakeholders at the federal, but also at the state level, to make sure that there was coordination and communication across the different stakeholders. So there was also a great engagement in consultations with public and private sector stakeholders in several states. So some states include Abuja, Kano, Lagos, but others. There was also an involvement, an inclusive approach adopted in the design of the reform action plans, and also the monitoring and supervision of reform implementation process. So it's not only in the design of the reform action plan, but how they were implemented. And then what were the results that we were able to see at the end of the engagement? There was a strong reform momentum that picked up. There were 4 laws that were enacted, among which a major reform, so the Company and Allied Matters Act that was passed, and which simplified and put in place a much streamlined business environment that allowed for simplified business registration, but also several aspects across corporate governance. The time to start a business was reduced, for instance, from 14 to 8 days in the state of Kano, and then from 10 to 7 days in Lagos. Nigeria was also recognized among the top 20 reforming economies on the business environment matters. And then this has also opened the door for subsequent reforms, most recently the Business Facilitation Act of February 2023, which just happened now. Next slide, please. Okay. Somalia is another country where we have successfully engaged on reforms. And so the challenge here is that businesses operating in a legal and regulatory vacuum, the legal texts were outdated. There was little or no formal government enforcement given the security situation and the fragility. So security was a particular challenge on the ground. There was missing data. There was no data in the government when it pertains to private sector and the business environment. So no ownership records for companies, no company accounts. So it was very hard because we were starting from a data vacuum. The country had the government institutions involved in business environment had low capacity, and also there was a high turnover of counterparts. So the approach that we adopted, we started by diagnostic work, a detailed diagnostic work, which included a process mapping of the different aspects that needed to be reformed. There was an engagement with the private sector to mobilize input into the laws and regulations, but also to support for the law. There was a public-private dialogue platform that was set up. And then we complemented the legal reform with capacity building. So given the security situation, the team relied on inviting the clients from the key agencies for capacity building and dialogue meetings outside of Somalia. And then we also relied on the adoption of digital services. So the technical assistance that we provided, including setting up online business registration and online system for granting of permits so that companies can register and operate formally. And then finally, to ensure government buy-in and identify a reform champion, we worked with the government to appoint key advisors in ministries as a stabilizing strategy. The result was that the new Somalia Companies Act was adopted in 2019, and the regulations were adopted in 2020. And then they were updated in 2021. The new law that was passed protected the creditors, the shareholders, in addition to simplifying business entry. And that was a main precondition for foreign investors also to consider coming into the country. The introduction of an online business registration and licensing system helped a lot cut the red tape for entrepreneurs who wanted to formally start a business. Next slide, please. Next slide, Ella. Thank you. So what are some of the key takeaways for the audience to keep in mind? So governments in fragile and conflict settings can support business-led growth, and they can help break free from the fragility trap. So because enabling the appropriate private sector activities have shown in many countries to be a mean for countries to break free from fragility. And as a result, business enabling environment, putting in place the business enabling environment is a solid opportunity for reaching this goal. The other takeaway is that there is no one-size-fits-all solution for designing and implementing reforms in fragile countries. Clustering countries by fragility profile shows a lot of heterogeneity, so there needs to be a differentiated policy and programming approach depending on the country context, the fragility or the conflict or violence that exists in the country. And then in addition to the type or theme for the reform, as Nora has mentioned, how the reform is implemented is critical for ensuring the success. So tailoring business enabling environment reform engagements to the specific manifestations of fragility, making sure that institution building takes place in parallel, can deliver on ensuring not only the reform is passed, but also it's being sustained. And then strengthening public and private sector dialogue is another element. And then finally, key elements of success include, as I mentioned, building institutions and systems that can deliver on inclusive growth, making sure all the actors are engaged throughout the reform process. Thank you. Back to you, Judith.
Yeah. These are really interesting takeaways. Just a very quick summary. It was really interesting to hear that the type of interventions are important, but even more so the way in which they are designed and implemented, and that you underlined the do no harm approach, and that you also shared some tools and approaches to take into consideration the challenges of the fragility context, and making sure that the approach is inclusive and that it covers all business segments so that the social cohesion can be increased. I was also happy to hear that it can be done, even though there are challenges, and that you shared some key takeaways, such as the importance of private-public dialogue and enhancing competition, and also the need to strengthen institutions. And with that, I would like to hand over to Nancy Benjamin, who is the economic researcher associated with the Development Policy Research Unit at the University of Cape Town. And she will be talking about dealing with informality in conflict and fragile settings. Over to you, Nancy.
Thank you. I hope you can all hear me. It's my pleasure to participate in this webinar, and I appreciate the participation of many institutions. There's a lot of expertise on business environment reforms in fragility. And so I think I'm just going to since a number of important points were made in the previous presentation, I'm just going to take a slice here on informality, which is a subject of long-term study from me. We can move ahead to the next slide. I won't read this, but there's a definite a common notion about fragility is exposure to a new risk, could be conflict or some other kind of risk, and an inability to cope, that the state is weak, it doesn't have capacity to cope with new challenges, new threats, new situations. We move on, next slide, to informality. I should say there is no single definition of informality accepted by economists, but everybody uses what makes the most sense to the issue they're looking at. But there is a general consensus that that it involves a number of characteristics and indeed a continuum of characteristics. So some of them are here in bold in this first paragraph about fixed place of business, formal accounts, being registered, paying formal taxes, etc. And that a firm can be informal along one or many of these dimensions. And that there is a continuum of these characteristics. You can have a little bit of some and a lot of others. And yet we are interested in modernization or formalization of informal firms. I'm going to talk a bit about informality in fragile and conflict states, but I think it's worthwhile to keep in mind why do we concern ourselves with formalization? Why should we even be interested? And the point simply is that the data show from all countries is that formal firms function better than informal firms. They have higher productivity. They offer better and more stable jobs with more social protection. There are many other things to say, but the data on formal firms show that they have a number of practices and characteristics that show that they function better and they contribute better to the economy. And that's why we keep an interest in moving informal firms along this continuum so that they behave more like the better functioning formal firms. If we go next slide and look at how informal firms have a role in fragile and conflict states, the World Bank typically always likes to find opposite of negative terms and introduce positive terms. So what's the opposite of fragility? It's resilience. So how are we looking for, how can we cultivate resilience? If we're dealing with governments that can't really cope and can't really adjust to the circumstances they're in, but informal firms are the opposite. They are the firms that adjust and manage under difficult circumstances, mainly because they don't have any choice. We find the World Bank research has shown that the best source of resilience in fragile and conflict states is jobs and economic opportunity. That's where people find resilience. That's how they adjust, how they cope with difficult circumstances. And most of these jobs and economic opportunities, particularly for the disadvantaged, are in the informal sector. If you have to adjust and move quickly, it's the informal actors who have the agility, the resilience to adjust and adapt. As I said, they're all they don't function as well as formal firms, but when the institutions, the system, the structure that supports formality, when that is not working, or when you have a fragile or conflict situation, people adapt informal means of adjusting. And we can see that in looking at fragile and conflict states. We saw that they say that, excuse me, jobs in the informal sector have a definite counter-cyclical nature, meaning their share increases during episodes of economic instability. And we can see that if we look at the next slide, this was actually from Speakman and Rysova. They're using data from Schneider, but in any case, what they're saying is that that there's a kind of a tradition or normality about where formal firms tend to locate, both in terms of size of firm, and if you look at the top of their chart and the sector that they're working in. And when fragile and conflict circumstances arise, that line between the orange and the blue tends to shift inward toward the origin, and we get a higher share of informal firms and more and across the spectrum of size and across the different sectors. So if we, so informality plays a very important role in the resilience and adaptation within the economy, and yet formal firms work better. So how can we create a business environment reform that not only allows economic opportunity, allows jobs even for the most disadvantaged, while at the same time strengthening the environment so that they can take on more of the characteristics of formal firms. So on next slide, of talking about policy approaches. First thing is the countries in general, these countries are going to need assistance, a lot of it, and over a long period of time. And that the types of reforms, even the ones that were just spoken about, they're going to take time. But that also informal firms are going to need help. They're going to need help in terms of grants, technical assistance, a number of things. Some people feel like the unlevel playing field is the informal, and I disagree. You may think otherwise, but nevertheless, they need assistance. A lot of governments, they want to move in and tax the informal. They say, here's the informal, here's another source of tax revenue. Other people want to sell them credit. I know it's usually described as offering or supplying, but the truth is any commercial entity that comes with credit is trying to make a return. And it's been demonstrated over and over again, the informal sector doesn't have it. And as Blattman and others have showed, they do better with grants. At first, the issue is terms. All businesses need credit. The problem is that the informal sector cannot handle commercial terms. They operate on what we would call family terms, meaning internal sources of credit from people that they know personally. There is a section in the paper about local governments serving as fallback institutions. I won't get into that now for lack of time, but you can look at the paper and read about that. The one place where they cannot serve as a substitute is in macroeconomic stability. I just came back from Sri Lanka, and I'll tell you, if the federal government cannot maintain macro stability, you're looking at trouble, and local governments cannot make up for that gap. Just one last, next slide, one last note about the credit. And this shows we've done surveys in a number of countries asking people where they get their credit, and they're almost all internal family sources, retained earnings, and also suppliers' credits are not uncommon. Let's move to the last slide. I will conclude here. When you look at the different characteristics, things that characterize informality and what can help modernize them and make them better, improve their practices in the direction of formal firms, there's a lot of research, and it all shows the same thing. Getting informal firms to sign pieces of paper saying they're now registered does almost nothing for their practices and for their productivity. What has the biggest impact is access to infrastructure. This has the greatest impact in terms of raising productivity of informal firms. And along with a number of things that were mentioned in the previous presentation, it's a way of engaging with firms. Investing in infrastructure provides a way to engage with firms, provide jobs, even for the unskilled, help signal a phase of rebuilding. And I'd like to just end with one last comment about the future. And the reason why this matters is because, as has been mentioned, most of the firms that are currently, the countries that are currently in fragile or conflict state have been so before. Virtually every country in conflict in the 21st century was so before in the late 20th century. And we have repeated incidences of conflict and fragility. And as was mentioned in the previous administration, issues of equity, of unlevel playing fields, of elite capture, these things come in again and again. And regulation on infrastructure is an important instrument for ensuring access. Access is important, and regulation is an important way to ensure access. I'll finish with that.
Thank you so much, Nancy. This is a topic which is very interesting and close to my heart. We are a little bit behind on schedule, so I will immediately hand over to the next speaker. This is Andrea Marusic, and she is Senior Private Sector Development Specialist in Finance, Competitiveness, and Innovation Global Practice in the World Bank. Over to you, Andrea.
Thank you, Judith. I hope you can hear me well. Greetings from Jerusalem. I'm very happy to be presenting in the context of this particular group, since I was really involved also when I was part of the global team and chairing the business environment working group for a number of years. So very happy to be here. So I'm going to give you a sort of digest version of a bottom-up view of a reform that is still underway. And maybe while you move to the first slide, one thing maybe I wanted to say, just to keep in mind, especially for those who have not worked in the context of FCS, is that whatever the situation is, life goes on. People get up, they go to work. There are companies that operate under the circumstances, and that is sort of something not to lose sight of. So what I'm going to cover here is the engagement we had with the Ministry of National Economy on the reform of the companies law that spans from 2017 and is still ongoing today. Give you some highlights both on the process and the substance, and then some observations and lessons on what we learned. And having in mind in particular the FCS context, because many things are similar for whichever environment we operate in, but I try to sort of extract something that is particular for this environment. So moving on to the next slide. So you see here a timeline of this reform, which, as I said, spans from 2017 and is still ongoing today. And we started in 2017, obviously, with a diagnostic. It was very clear that the need for reform is there, considering that the regulatory framework for companies to operate in was based on a 1964 law. And so we did this high-level review, and we were working with local law firms, and of course in cooperation with the Ministry of Economy to do that. And when we started that, we insisted on really an overhaul, not just tweaking the current situation. And maybe just to mention here that initially the law firms we were working with, they were very adamant in making it very clear to us that this will never happen. So in a way, you see here, that just the amount of time that was necessary to come to an enacted new companies law, which was happening in 2021, was really, a long and bumpy ride. So maybe just another detail to mention here in the whole process was that once there was a really good draft in place that was consulted with stakeholders, with private sector, it was ready to be submitted to cabinet for approval. You will see in this timeline in 2019, we had a change of the Minister of Economy, and that is when we painfully remembered the words we heard at the beginning that this will never happen. We thought at that point, indeed, that is the case. Since 2 years of effort evaporated in a matter of days, the new minister decided to start essentially from zero with a new working group that was sort of really composed of many of the people who wanted to retain the status quo. So it took us 2 years really of heavy engagement to go back to the drawing board and revert back to the work that was done for 2 years and finally come to the enactment of the law in 2021. We can move to the next slide. So, as I said, we were in an environment of having a 1964 legal framework for companies. I don't think I need to explain what that means in the context of how, corporate law has evolved over the decades and how much companies are affected by such an outdated regulatory environment. So, anyone who knows anything about the private sector knows that when you ask them, what do you need from government, they would typically say, well, actually nothing. We really just want to be left alone to do what we do best. So here it was completely the opposite. So a lot of the discretionary power of the company's registrar, essentially heavy involvement and interference in the day-to-day operation of companies, including sort of the right to replace the board of directors if the company is in some sort of distress. Investors, foreign impediments to FDI, forcing them to enter into joint venture with local partners and with local signatory with a maximum of 25% of shares. No possibility to register as a single member company, something that is maybe typical was at least typical in the region. One of the investors I talked to, who is from the diaspora, Palestinian from the UK that came to Palestine to invest, had to engage his 80-year-old dad to go and register a company with him, and faced many other burdens. And in fact, he told me, had I known what I will face, I would have never started this endeavor. So maybe we can move to the next slide. I'm trying to go a bit faster because we're a bit behind time. So in terms of the modality that we deployed, it was really all hands on deck. So, the whole spectrum of name it, carrots, sticks, everything in between. When it comes to bank instruments, this means that we had technical assistance of approximately 500,000 that was invested into the diagnostic, technical work, just to mention also that we had really heavy global regional collaboration that worked very well. I will say a bit more on that in the lessons. We had lending that was meant to support sort of a big carrot, really, because it was is just now being deployed to fund the infrastructure for the automation of the company's registry implementation, about 2.5 million. And then this was also backed by what we call development policy lending, in this case grant, where there was a prior action, budget support with a prior action, which was the enactment of the company's law. Next slide. So, as I mentioned, this is the law was indeed enacted in 2021, and it brings a lot of benefits for companies. Really, something, as I said, it was an overhaul. I don't want to spend too much time on this, but it really spans from reforming, completely overhauling the company's registry, transparency, e-registration. It introduces new legal entity types that were not available for smaller companies. We talked about informality. So, sort of the first, maybe next step from informality to being formal is really enabling the appropriate legal forms, such as a limited liability company, where you can have a single member that's also the director, where the structure is simple, the governance is simple, everything is simple. Ease of exit as well, very important, because it's nice to lure people to register, but then if they cannot get easily out of it, it becomes a huge problem. So there are really clear rules on voluntary mandatory liquidation. maybe, you know, one thing which I am particularly happy with and proud that was achieved was the fact that it provides also promotion of women in leadership roles by providing at least 30% women in boards of public shareholding companies. So super modern law, super really, you know, in line with the good international practice we see in developed countries, but also aligned to the local context, which I will mention later. We can move to the next slide. This, you know, I just wanted to say something about the complexities. They're listed here. I don't want to go through them individually, but maybe, you know, just to say how difficult the process was in terms of coming to this result was also that we at some point reached a wall, which I mentioned when the minister changed, and then they came up with a sort of anti-reform draft that was very disappointing, that was retaining the status quo essentially. And at which point we had a meeting, a high-level meeting with the Prime Minister, and where we outlined maybe the options he has to sort of move to a pro-reform, a real reform. And at that point, we also gave us an option, you know, if you guys want to proceed with the adoption of this anti-reform draft, this is of course the prerogative of the authorities, but it will have to be without our support. So we really, you know, kind of one of the benefits of working in FCS is also, or smaller, let's say, maybe not only FCS, but smaller countries, is also that you have direct access to the decision makers, to the minister, the ear of the Prime Minister. There was also huge support from our management, our country director, regional vice president. Maybe we can move along to the next slide, which is the last slide. So in terms of giving some observations and lessons, again, from the lens of what's specific in terms of having this sort of reform in FCS, I must, like, first thing I want to say is that I was part of this journey throughout this reform. In fact, now I'm now based in Jerusalem. I started from DC in 2017 as part of the global team. And then I moved to Europe and Central Asia, still was involved in Palestine. So one important thing is, of course, the, well, perseverance, I would say, is the key word here. Perseverance, not only in terms of the institutional perseverance, but also it was important that we have the same team throughout this reform. And it's not, it's now in its 5th year and still ongoing. So that's the, maybe one of the lessons is that it took us 4 years to get to the adoption of the reforms, with ups and downs and needing high-level management support, very granular technical assistance throughout. And we are right now in the phase of implementation, where we will need at least 2-3 more years for implementation, which inshallah will happen, starting from the automation of the business registry to everything that's needed in terms of implementation, registration forms, regulations, training of judges, training of lawyers, because it's not only about, of course, as we all know, enacting the law, but also everything that has to happen after so that it's really implemented. So I just, as a last thing I want to say is very proudly sort of say that the World Bank additionality here was, I think, crucial. I wouldn't say so for some of the other countries I worked in. As I said, I was in Europe and Central Asia working on EU member states. And while, you know, some of the issues are even there common, the fact is that if the World Bank was not there, that would have happened somehow anyway. Here, I'm not sure. Like, I don't, if we weren't involved at this level and for such a long time, I don't think this would have happened. This was something that was being in the making for over 20 years unsuccessfully. Various ministers, various drafts were circulating, never happened. So I believe the right mixture for us was the same team working throughout. We had both global knowledge and presence on the ground, ears and eyes on the ground, direct communication with the minister, prime minister, the full spectrum of instruments that I mentioned that we leveraged. And then maybe to mention the need to be flexible and deploy innovative approaches. Very often we would hear from the opponents to this reform, which were many, vested interests, lawyers, bar associations that are used to having their own way and that have their own channels to providing the services that they provide. We would hear, oh, this is a World Bank draft, which was not the case, is not the case. And it was adapted heavily to the local context. Just to give an example, we gave the registrar.
Sorry, Andrea,
am I out of time?
Yes,
okay.
Sorry to interrupt. In the interest of time, if you could wrap up, or maybe if you're
sure, in the next 15 seconds. So flexibility, providing solutions that are adapted to the ground, and then last but not least, really perseverance and granular support, both pre-adoption and in implementation. Absolutely essential. Thanks a lot.
Thank you so much. And with that, we go to the very interesting next speaker, who's John Lewis, and he's professor of international management at the University of Sussex, and also at the Graduate School of Business at the University of Cape Town. And he will be sharing lessons from 4 African countries. Over to you, John.
Great, thank you so much, and hi everyone. So our paper comes at BER from a slightly different angle, in that we try to get as many stakeholder opinions about reforms undertaken in these 4 countries. And so there is sometimes a more critical voice, which I think is important for us to consider. So next slide, please. So our objective in this paper was to advance the understanding of the nexus between BER and the SDGs, and SDG 16 in particular, mindful of the interconnections between conflict, fragility, and underdevelopment. And we examined the evidence based on the experience of 4 African countries, namely Rwanda, Sierra Leone, Uganda, and Ethiopia. I'm not going to go through the literature review or methodology, but just to highlight the data collection, it draws on several data sources, including one-on-one interviews, roundtable focus groups, and secondary data. All in all, we interviewed 83 respondents actively involved in BER in these countries, including country experts, investors, policymakers, and civil society. Next slide, please. So before getting to the overarching themes, Table 2 provides a broad overview of the 4 countries, which, as you can see, differ substantially across a variety of dimensions. By the numbers, Ethiopia's population is around 120 million, while Sierra Leone's is only 8.4 million. And the size of the economies vary likewise from 111 billion to 4 billion respectively. Very importantly, all 4 countries demonstrate considerable differences and dualities between urban and rural areas. Next slide, please. So in terms of BER experience, Ethiopia and Rwanda appear to have been most effective in using laws and formal state institutions as tools for implementing policies. Whilst, in Uganda and Sierra Leone, these 2 countries really represent states where the formal system really describes how decisions are actually made or implemented. Also, in terms of timelines, Ethiopia and Rwanda's current reform path can be traced back to the mid-1990s, whilst for Sierra Leone and Uganda, they started more recently in the early 2000s. In terms of impact, the interviews demonstrated that whether one considers BER successful or not really depends on what one regards as its primary objectives. So if, for example, one measures success by reduction in transaction costs, then interventions such as one-stop shops have had positive effects, most notably in Rwanda. I think, very few countries in modern history have targeted BER as systematically and as explicitly as Rwanda has. And there is substantial evidence that it has successfully reduced transaction costs of doing business and made the business environment more attractive. And interestingly, the interviewees, and this is right across the board, associated BER with the country's rapidly improving macroeconomic trends, as well as with progress against development indicators. As you know, the country set very ambitious economic and social targets and monitored them very carefully. And BER was an integral part of this execution, and in terms of how they developed these key performance indicators. But results are not uniform. And for example, in Uganda, the one-stop shop was described by respondents as one more stop, or that the motivation was about increasing tax revenues rather than genuine human development, which I think links to an earlier point that was made. And concerns were also expressed by some that BER may bestow advantages on foreign investors or politically connected individuals who get access to this oasis of efficiency, but that smaller and often domestic players are not able to get access to these advantages and have to survive in the dysfunctional system, increasing their sense of exclusion. Turning to the political economy, I think the complexities of the political economy of BER have not always led to outcomes compatible with inclusive development. The very factors that make a context fragile, such as rent seeking, a tendency to act along well-worn conflict lines, and contested power and legitimacy between the center and the periphery. This can undermine attempts to address fragility through BER. And so, for example, it was perceived by some to be associated with the consolidation of economic and political power by a ruling elite rather than broad-based expansion. Additionally, in countries in which up to 80% of the population engages in subsistence agriculture, there was a view that BER is to some extent, there's a danger that it can be seen as an elite activity whose benefits accrue disproportionately to large players in the formal economy. And there's a danger that it may displace local communities from land, which is set aside for foreign enterprises. And this is especially so in land-hungry sectors such as mining or commercial agriculture. Next slide, please. So the four cases demonstrate that whilst BER can have a positive effect, and they have done so in some cases, there is a danger that they can actually, in some cases, exacerbate conflict and undermine development goals. From the project level, for example, if local employment isn't prioritized, or if there is a shift towards commercial agriculture without looking at how subsistence agriculture is brought with, this might actually lead to, might actually fuel deep-rooted conflicts over land. And we would contend that BER has the greatest potential to advance the SDGs when it is attentive to three objectives at the same time. And these are, stimulating broad-based economic growth, expanding economic opportunities in both formal and informal markets, and addressing directly the drivers of conflict and fragility. So, from this figure, our argument is that it can be part of a broader development plan, but this does require a consensus, systems-based approach that recognizes the complex network of interconnected business interests, agendas, and systems, and balancing these competing interests. If you look at the figure, I think the first relates to the exercise of power between formal and traditional authorities, and between national and regional government. The second relates to the prioritization of BER for human development, in particular for the benefit of subsistence farmers, the urban poor, and women. And then the third, and I think this is a really important fact, relates to the impact on horizontal inequities between those in the formal and in informal economies, between urban and rural populations, and between different regions, particularly where these are politically or ethnically defined. Final slide, please. So lastly, some considerations which are important for future discussions. I think one is the relationship of BER to the informal economy. In Africa, where more than 80% of the labor force is tied to the informal sector, there's a danger that BER risks becoming irrelevant to much of the economy, particularly those parts affecting the most vulnerable population. And so how it can contribute towards the development of informal economies and indigenous livelihoods and not crowd out these activities is important, as I think has been alluded to in earlier presentations as well. Second, the case studies point towards a need to further examine the impacts of BER on the consolidation of power and whether it further entrenches elite interests at the expense of broad-based development. And then I think lastly, and this is an area that I don't think has been mentioned thus far, is what this requires from international business. And I think multinational corporations need to be a lot more conflict sensitive, understanding the interactions of their presence and operations with key drivers of conflict and how they may introduce new dynamics. And we also need to recognize that this may require the development of new and atypical capabilities for business to navigate these dynamics. So lots of work to be done. Thank you. That's it from me.
Thank you so much, John, for an interesting presentation. And with that, I would like hand over to the next speaker, who is Nabila Assad, and she is a practice manager in Fragility, Conflict, Violence, and Forced Displacement Group at the World Bank, and she will share her reflections on the topic. Over to you.
Thank you so much. I just want to check if my audio is clear.
All that.
Okay, thank you for inviting me to be a discussant in this session. This is really close to my heart because before being in the Fragility, Conflict, and Violence group, I was in the Finance, Competitiveness, and Innovation group, and I spent most of my career bouncing between private sector development and fragility and conflict. So this is absolutely the nexus of what I have worked on and thought about over the course of my career. So it's been fascinating to listen to all of these presentations. I have a challenging task because there's limited time, but I want to not repeat what others have said, but to try to pull out a few key themes and points that I thought really emerged from all of the different presentations, which were really excellent in the fact that they come at it from very diverse different aspects. So to my mind, one of the first questions on my mind always is, why does business environment reform matter in fragile and conflict affected contexts, and what would be our objective in working on business environment reforms? And it's an important question because, as John had just pointed out, if we know that in fragile and conflict affected contexts, firms tend to be informal. Lots of times, business environment reforms might focus on de jure reforms that perhaps don't have a lot of impact on most of the firms in the country. Why would this be a priority, and what is our objective in undertaking business environment reforms? And I think it's important because it also would shape what kind of business environment reforms we should be focused on. When we're talking about BER, sort of typically or classically, often it's linked to growth and investment objectives, which of course is valid and important. But I think the point that Nancy highlighted in that there's another objective that's linked to resilience is really important to emphasize it's important because it would help us focus on what kind of business environment reforms, which sectors we might need to focus on. If our objective is growth, actually, it might actually lead us to want to focus on perhaps some reforms that reinforce the status quo, focus on sectors or firms most likely to grow, and therefore might actually reinforce entrenched interests or exacerbate some exclusion dynamics in the country. If we're focused on resilience, we might find ourselves focusing on a whole different set of actors or sectors or types of reforms. So this isn't always going to be the case, of course. There's as many different ways and in which a country's manifest fragility and conflict as there are actually FCS countries, but it's important for us to kind of think about what is our actually objective and how does that interplay with the FCV dynamics. So that brings me to so thinking about is our objective growth and investment, is it resilience, is it some combination between, I think is really important to start out with, to take that step back. Second point I want to make is about linking to the drivers of fragility and conflict and that context in the country. So whether we're aiming for growth or resilience or some balance between these impacts, that's going to affect the design and scope of what kind of intervention or project that we're working on, whether we're focusing on formal or informal sector, whether we're looking at de facto or de jure type business environment reforms, which sectors we focus on. Are they the sectors that represent the largest potential for investment, or are they the sectors that might contribute to jobs and livelihoods and resilience and maybe social stability, right, in certain parts of the country? So we need to set our goals to respond to a particular problem. And what I think what's important is that means that we need to link the entire business and BER agenda to the drivers of fragility and conflict, to an understanding of where the areas of contestation over control of resources and power lie in the country, where the actors and interests lie, both political and economic, and respond to that. So linking our BER goals to the drivers of fragility would help actually shape the objectives of the business environment reform. And unfortunately, as everybody who works in this space know, there's always going to be this tension between where there's political will and champions for reform and what reforms might truly benefit, perhaps a broader swath of business owners, and would benefit those outside of the tight circles of the elites. And it's a challenge not to avoiding to be nudged towards, window dressing reforms that, are in the comfortable space for those that we might tend to interact with in a more traditional public-private dialogue, for example. So for instance, competition reforms that maybe are linked to commodity markets, public procurement, the kind of things that have enormous potential for creating opportunities for domestic firms, reducing costs, those are notoriously difficult to actually prioritize. And public-private dialogue, there was a question in the chat, can be particularly difficult and can actually be captured and used to reinforce elite capture. So how can we work on it in a different way? Less theater, less high level in the capitals, maybe more grassroots and closer to the ground, so that it's actually engaging a broader range of stakeholders. So I think having this understanding and this very intrinsic link between the business environment reform, much more so than we typically might, with the broader context of fragility and a diagnostic and understanding of the political economy and fragility and conflict drivers in the country, becomes really essential. It's true for non-FCS. I think there was a question saying how are some of these different? It's a continuum, right? But it's just the consequences of not doing so, and the risks are much more attendant in FCS countries. Also, in terms of how to actually work on business environment reforms in a way that is itself resilient. Andrea talked about how change administered derailed the entire reform. Again, these things show up in non-FCS situations, but there's less institutional resilience. We know this in FCS context. So how can we actually design our interventions in a way that is actually resilient, involving a broader range of stakeholders, thinking about if we're supporting reforms to put in place capacity and services, where those are placed. I can share that there was a very sad moment for me to see the one-stop shop in Sana'a in Yemen and what it looked like after so much investment had been put into it. So centralizing capacity in one place in some of our more classical interventions may not work. Checking the time. The other really important point is responding to, so that's in terms of responding to the context and the drivers and the fragility and understanding the political economy. I think the other aspect is really responding to the characteristics of the private sector in the country and their needs. And this brings us to a lot of what's been brought up on the informal sector. Nancy spoke about this at length, and we know that firms in fragile and conflict states tend to be smaller, more informal, and where they're formal, they tend to be sole proprietors. So they have very little protection against risk. They have very limited coping capacities against risk. So the importance of risk mitigation, risk sharing, and understanding the risk that these firms face, it becomes really critical. Business risk becomes personal and family risk. It's much more immediate, I would say, for firms in these situations, and the context is a higher risk in and of itself, and they have less coping mechanisms to deal with those risks. So when we're thinking about what kind of reforms matter, again, it comes to, are we focused on resilience? Are we focused on growth? In this case, even if we're focused on growth and are trying to nudge informal firms along that continuum that Nancy referred to between informal and formal, that would imply potentially different types of business environment reforms, perhaps those that can benefit the informal sector, benefit the smallest of firms. Formalization might be, a typical path, and there's some classical approaches to that. But if we think of informality and formality as a continuum, there might be interesting reforms and spaces to explore and focus on there. Perhaps John's paper had mentioned in Ethiopia focuses on agribusiness reforms related to fertilizer programs and rural roads, which are not, reforms, are more investments, but there's other, aspects maybe in terms of access to the financial sector, for informal businesses, recognition of household businesses and enabling them, downscaling, capacity building and training for small informal businesses, market information. There might be various types of areas that would be a focus if we keep in mind the nature of the firms, that we're looking at. Also, I think what's interesting is maybe thinking about business environment reform and social protection as something of a continuum, and this comes to the issue of risk. So it would be interesting to think about when we're looking at business environment reforms, if we know that many of these firms are small, informal, or even household businesses, is social protection reform actually just a continuum of business environment reform, because some of the risk mitigation might come from that side of the policy continuum. So that's maybe something for us to think about a bit more. Another point to attend to is the issue of doing no harm, and this came up in a few of the presentations. Nora spoke about it, as did John, but understanding what are the drivers of fragility and conflict, the actors, the interests, the contestation over interests and resources and power, and how we work with that, ensuring that support for particular sectoral reforms or particular types of reforms won't exacerbate any kind of tensions or fragility, focusing on understanding where there might be vested interests. I think there's an interesting piece of work that was not written with FCS in mind, but is relevant here, which is about privilege-resistant policy reform in MENA. I think there's some aspects there that are interesting, because it actually helps focus on how can we work on reforms in such a manner while understanding the need to avoid elite capture and ensure that reforms are not distorted towards serving the interests of the elite. So I think there's some literature there that can also be useful. So all of these complexities in terms of linking BER to the fragility and conflict context, responding to a different mix and nature of firms, and ensuring that we're doing no harm, means that we're dealing in a much more complex situation. And I think what I took away from all the papers is, as complicated as we thought this was, and we always think it is going in, it's actually always more complicated than that. And so where does that leave us? I really liked, John, what was in the paper about adaptive peace building approach. It's very compelling. It's in sync with ideas we've been exploring in the World Bank on how to shift our emphasis from ex-ante planning to adaptive management in fragile and conflict contexts. This is also one of the lessons learned that came out from the review of the World Bank's Afghanistan program about the need for adaptiveness. So I think there's some very interesting thinking there, and it reinforces the points that were made about, avoiding technocratic approaches that are really disconnected from the broader context. I'm going to just stop there and end with advocating for having a much more in-depth assessment of and diagnostic of the situation before we're working on business environment. I think Naroz talked about in the presentation having an in-depth investment of all of the business environment constraints, which I totally agree with, but then would say that should be linked with a diagnostic of the fragile and conflict context of the drivers, the risks, the sources of resilience in the country, and having a linkage between these two in order to really be able to understand the best way forward. Investing in sectoral political economy analysis, I think, can be really helpful, as well as broad political economy analysis. And emphasizing that kind of work as really having a strong basis, and then using an adaptive approach from there. And the final word is reinforcing Andrea's point on patience and perseverance. It takes a lot of time. It's not going to be a straightforward path. Unfortunately, our institutions as development institutions, we are not really set up for this kind of adaptiveness and flexibility. We have programs with limited times and set objectives. And so I think this also implies that we have to think about how we actually engage in these countries and have a different model. So I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you, Nabila, for an excellent wrap up and bringing everything together. That was really informative. What I really took away from you, maybe if I want to summarize in one or two sentences, is we need to understand the drivers of fragility. The situations differ, interests, challenges differ. And if we understand this can then shape the objectives and also the kind of business environment reform that we need. It's challenging. We've heard examples, we've heard lessons, we've learned that it can be done. We need to take into consideration the challenges, the lessons, and the tools and the approaches, doing no harm. And I think with that, we've all been inspired on the way forward. As you have been seeing in the chat box, the recording is shared via the DCED YouTube channel. Publications are shared in the chat box. So I think I just want to close with that, thanking all the speakers, thanking the organizers, and thanking you as participants for having stayed with us and having asked many interesting questions. And all of them have been answered in the chat box. Unfortunately, we didn't have time to talk with you, but I hope your questions are well answered. And I look forward to future engagement on the topic with all of you. Thanks so much.